Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about Sexpectations. Here's a thought. How do you navigate some of the thorny waters when it comes to dealing with sex? And let's say you have a person who is, you're not really involved with them. You had a relationship with them at some point in time, at least a relationship enough to have been intimate. And, the relationship it was okay then, but for whatever reason it ended. Sometimes these things are something that just ended because people were in different places. Maybe people move away. People have other interests. Sometimes these things are really, really hard to define. It's just something that happens. But, when they're parts of a relationship that work, it is really hard to let go of the feelings. I mean, it's hard enough finding something that we enjoy and appreciate. And when it doesn't work out, it's really easy to get into that funky place where, God, you take it on and you think about yourself and you wonder, well, what did I do to ruin that relationship, or why didn't it work out? And maybe you've been down this road before, but it's open-ended. You don't really have an idea of what to do next. But then, and here, we're right around the corner from Valentine's Day. And you'll wonder if you should reach out to that person. What do you do? Do you reach out? Do you have a conversation? Do you give a gift? Is it just a text message or an email? What do you do? Well, let's talk about some scenarios. Let's say you decide to buy a gift, a small gift. Just something because you would like to do it. And you don't necessarily have any expectations around it. You do it because you like the fact that you make people feel good when you do nice things. But what follows is this reminder of the good chemistry you had. And like I said, when you don't really know why the relationship ended, it just is sort of nebulous, then it's hard to not want to have the good thing back. And it might be some guilt because you might be in a connection that's with somebody else. But because this other thing you didn't have closure with it, and you want to find closure. And, we do it in lots of different ways. Sometimes you have that last romp, that last roll in the hay. Sometimes it's just a peck on the cheek or a handshake or a hug. But when it's that sexpectation, when you just want to relive some of those experiences with people, and who's to say you can't just do it in your head, but you want to have that experience with them because it wasn't the sex that the relationship ended. It was just something else, like I said, this undefined. How do you navigate that? If you don't consider the thoughts and the feelings, it's just going to nag at you until you make a decision about something. And maybe it's hard to have the discipline to not think about it, because the more that thought creeps into your mind, then the more it screams that you've got to resolve it in some way, shape, or form. And, you can't just take a pill and make it go away. Because remember, what we're talking about here was a connection that actually meant something to you, but for whatever reason that can be hard to define down the road, you don't know why it ended. See, some relationships end with a bang. You have a big argument, a big blow up. Somebody did something that would be hard to forget. I mean, you can forgive them, but it's an incident. It's one of those cataclysmic things that you don't forget. But when it doesn't have that, it almost seems like, well, why did it end? And in our way of operating, this human part of us that loves companionship, that really enjoys the things that we do with other people that have been special to us, and we know how difficult that can be. Well, you just want to relive that, and you want to hang on to that. I mean, you don't necessarily want to cause any upset to other people. This is really more about you feeling good with that other person that felt good also. Again, this can be fairly thorny. And then when you have these occasions, these special days that you remember somebody like that, it could be, like I said, there's Valentine's Day, there could be their birthday coming around. And, heaven forbid you run into someone who looks like them or wears the same perfume or cologne and has the same type of voice or just has some similarity or something that triggers the thought of this person over and over that makes them hard to forget. You see, that really goes back to the quality of the individual, that they are hard to forget. I mean, think about it. Some of us have had relationships with people and, we wondered, wow, when it's over, what do we go, what do we do from here? And then, you get involved with the next person and you don't even think about the one that ended. Maybe it's one of those, hey, good riddance. I'm glad I'm out of that. It was just holding me back anyway. But when you have these connections with individuals that are very memorable, that are hard to forget, like I say, you're navigating some tough waters. And, it's not enough to just say, okay, this is wrong, or this is immoral, or something like that. Because those are words that, we can put an interpretation on it, but it doesn't help us resolve it. Because those kinds of things a lot of times relate to guilt. And when you're trying to guilt yourself into doing something, that has a different kind of effect. That has a lasting effect also. So we're not going to use mind tricks or, those kind of gymnastics, because they invariably come back and become part of our stuff that we have to deal with later. So we're just going to open up and be vulnerable and think about it. Now the reason I call it Sexpectation is because this is the sex show, for one, but sex has such a profound effect on how we behave around somebody we've been intimate with. Profound. And in a relationship with someone that was of this quality, or I should say this characteristic of, hey, it was a good connection. We did things together. For some reason, it just didn't work out. Like I said, sometimes you don't know why. And like I said, that makes it even harder, because when you don't have closure, then you keep trying to find a way to do it. Either you reboot or come to the understanding that, we're not going to. Well, up to this point, remember that conversation has been in your head. But now when I say that you've been in conversation with this person. In fact, not only conversation, but remember those thoughts. You would drive 100 miles to spend time with that person. That must be a really powerful feeling that you have for them. I'm going to let that settle. I'll I'll take a break, and I'll be right back after this. Stay tuned.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and we're back with the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, and I'm talking about Sexpectations. Here we have this relationship deal, or one that was a relationship at one time. You had some strong feelings for this individual. You didn't really make closure with it, and now there is the possibility that you are going to reconnect, and let's say maybe you have at this point, and you're wondering, well, you want to be physically intimate with this person. What is it about having sex with this person that's going to, say, put this thing to rest for you? And is this going to be something like a one and done? Remember, I mentioned the possibility that, at least in our fantasy here, it might rekindle the thing and get it going again. Because when it sort of ended, it didn't really end. It just stopped. It just stopped happening. Because we've talked about relationships that when they end with a bang, that is, with a big argument or a breakup, you kind of know it makes closure with it right there. But when it doesn't have that event, and I mean, it's nicer not to have a big argument, but when it doesn't have that event, then it almost feels like it leaves the door open. And I think we've all had relationships with somebody who just didn't really want to break up with us. So they just left the idea that, well, maybe we can get back together later after I take care of myself, meaning after I fix myself with whatever is broken. And I think a lot of women have had that experience where they've been with a guy and then something comes up and he disappears. He ends the relationship by saying something like, well, I have to work on myself. Sometimes it's after you've had sex, and sometimes it isn't. But if it's after one of those times that you have, that's kind of like a guy throwing that thing out there that he feels guilty, and he, in some respects, knows that he can't really handle a relationship with the person. He was just trying it out. He was taking it for a test ride. He was probably pumping it up just to make it seem like he was really, really interested. I mean, guys do that. And then, not to leave out the fact that some guys really find out that they're not up to the task of being in a relationship with someone who's really serious. I think we find that out from time to time before we become intimate. But in the beginning, when you first meet somebody, the relationship is pretty intense. They focus on you. They give all of their free time to you. They make time for you. So that's not really free time, but they will make time for you. And then after you've had the sex, it could be this, maybe it wasn't all it's cracked up to be, and they don't know how to have that conversation. Some people define those situations like, well, it was only there for the chase, and then after he caught you, that it was, he lost interest. I think that's a way of describing what happened, but that doesn't really explain it. And the difference is we can interpret many things when we see an action, but it doesn't explain what really happens. And I think we go for the quick answers. Why? Because we're trying to make sense of it. We want to make closure with whatever thing that's bothering us. And some things are simple, but this one not so. And if you've ever been a guy and you've been in this situation, the thing that you're thinking about what you're thinking about in those moments is that you don't want to be found out and you don't want to be called a liar to your face. You just want to exit the situation and go on about your life. And the other thing too is what's going on in your head, in a guy's head. There's a lot of guilt because there's the old tape of when women talk about being used, and then as a guy, you realize that you just added to that list of guys who used you and just left. Guys do that. Women will do that too. I'm not just going to make that exclusive to guys. I've known of it. I mean, not personally me, but I've known of situations like that because I've actually talked to women who've done that sort of thing, and in their minds, and I'll say this about the people that I've spoken to, it had a bit of a revenge quality to it. In the experience that it was a kind of similar to what I'm describing here when you have a relationship that didn't really have any closure. And there were just things that are hanging out there. He wanted to reconnect. And with a situation like this, there was the idea that, well, I'm going to reconnect, but I'm just going to show them what they left, what they're missing out on, with no real intention of getting back together, just showing them what they missed out on, to let the guy know that, you lost and somebody else is going to get this. The other thing that happens in these kinds of scenarios is people aren't really in the mind of that they can handle something more serious, more direct, more ongoing, a relationship. So they only take the fringe parts, and not like sex is fringe, but it's a part of a relationship, and that's one of the good parts. So they will nibble into that and not want to have to commit any more to it. They just want to take it and see if it's like it was when the relationship was going on. It's like that fantasy that you keep playing over and over in your mind. It just won't leave you alone. So is this how guys think? Because they say guys think about sex way more times a day than a woman does. So you become obsessed about it until you resolve it in some way, shape, or form. Now, how you resolve it, I think, really depends on your status in life. If you're involved in a relationship, you understand that to be your primary relationship, it's monogamous, then you basically have to, cut that idea aside, maybe go to therapy, take up running, go to the gym, maybe play video games or something till you can get past those moments. But if you're single and you don't have any commitments, something that would prevent you from reconnecting with that person, and you probably go for it. Give it a shot and see what happens. Now, what the other person decides is okay for them, now that's the other part of the equation. You could put out the overture that you want to reconnect, you want to be with that person, and I'm talking physically, intimately, and they may accept your invitation or not. I think guys are usually more into trying to make those physical encounters happen because guys are horny. I mean, they find that's a part of who they are, and some embrace their sexuality in, I think, a more healthy way. That is, they consider it something that they're not just going to be out with any and everyone. They're going to be selective. I hope that they would be, but that this person actually meant something to them in one time, and feeling close to them, and definitely being sexual is a way of being close to somebody, then they want to rekindle that. And I think perhaps the idea here too, and this is operating in the back of the mind, is that if they feel like the sex is good, then they'll want to come back to the relationship. See, that's something that's underneath this in an occasion like this. Even if in the other experience I was talking about, if the person, even if they were involved in a relationship already and this opportunity comes around, and you might ask the question, well, if they're already involved, why would they take this opportunity to do something like this? Well, because guys are not used to having an offer like that in front of them and not taking it. See, temptation is really high for guys in situations like this, when it seems like it's just free for the offering. I think the only time something like that would become dangerous to a guy is if they know that there's going to be some really awful consequences. Like if the person is psycho and the person's going to go off, it'll make a guy really give a second thought about being around and for the fallout. Because we've all known situations that went way different than our own sexpectation. I'm going to take a break and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we're back. This is John Johnson talking about Sexpectations. And the scenario that I pointed out was a relationship that had, say, ended for whatever reason. I mean, there wasn't any real closure to it. And the opportunity sort of presents itself that you can reconnect with that person. You had pretty good sexual chemistry with them. And remember, the sex wasn't bad. It's just that the relationship just sort of stopped. And whether it was one or the other deciding that they needed to work on themselves or one of a host of other reasons, it just never made closure with it. And it could even be one of those things that was like an office romance that ended a bit amicably, so to speak. Again, it wasn't noisy, no big arguments that just made it really definitive that we are no longer together. And you keep running into that person. See, that is a difficult one too. You know, they talk about why office romances are taboo or no-no. But when you think about why you connect with people that you work with, is in some cases, you spend more time with them than you do anyone else. So we're not meant to be alone. And when you find somebody that you seem to develop some chemistry with, you want to keep going for it. But as it is with relationships, they all don't work out for long term. But say in a workplace scenario, see, the group dynamic is different, or just the dynamic of being in the workplace and meeting somebody. I mean, it's nice. You have proximity to them, and that may, because it's sort of artificial in that regard, you have access to them, you see them. It may make you believe that, wow, this is something that could possibly happen. And what you find out is outside of the office, outside of the workplace, we're different people. A lot of us are different people. You know, we play the role that we play in our group dynamic because that's how things shake out. You know, we have our pecking order. We sometimes are very cliquish. We dress a certain way. And any combination of those things could make someone seem very, very attractive to you. But absent that stage, so to speak, then things change and you have to figure out, well, how do you fit in with the rest of their life? And having sex with them isn't going to fix that or change that. You know, I say having a reboot without a real clear indication that there's a change in the status or the dynamic of what happened before it's just going to be a repeat. And it's just going to keep cycling until you've had 3 or 4 endings and then nothing. And ultimately, in situations like that, you wind up ending and avoiding each other, almost as if you're repulsed because you're embarrassed about the restart and the ending and the restart and the ending. And invariably, in a lot of these situations, there's somebody else that comes into your life and you've had some experiences with them, maybe physically intimate, because and when you have situations like this that are in close proximity time-wise, somebody's going to start feeling betrayed. And that kind of thing generates a lot of heat, meaning you can get some hurt feelings, some angry things happening, and that will end the relationship for sure. So if in the past, when you were first kind of trying to figure out, well, what wasn't working and it just sort of melted away, when you come back in a situation like that, yeah, it can get ugly. Not to mention when you start having partnerships that overlap, one of the things that becomes a dead giveaway is when you don't practice good sexual hygiene. I'm talking condoms for men or women. Doesn't matter who's bringing them, but the idea is when you're not sure about where you're going with this, you got to be careful. And I'm going to say this as someone who believes in being responsible sexually. You want to protect yourself and your partner, because there are lots of things out there that you don't have an understanding about. And I talked about this in my other podcast about STIs. So look at the catalog, you'll see which one it is. And in that particular podcast, there was quite a bit of information that I shared about how you contract it and how easy it is to transmit it. So practicing good sexual hygiene I think, should be a priority for you and your partner. Therefore, what you do with your time is your business, but it is also your responsibility. So be mindful and think before you act. Because if you don't, you may find out that there are a lot more people that are going to know about your business. And one of my sayings in this situation is, if you don't want people to know about it, then don't do it. So to all those who wonder if when you break up with somebody, or say it has, I call it a soft ending, that when that situation happens, because it seems like there might be a possibility for a reboot, you wonder if they actually care about you, or what's the motivation. There are lots of motivations, but I think one of which is there is that romantic notion, that the possibility of having that relationship again, because it wasn't necessarily bad, but for whatever reason, it just didn't come to an end. And that's a very difficult situation to transition, because we are used to endings. That's what happens in the books. That's what happens in the movies. They have endings. And when we have things in our life that are left undefined like that, it just leaves us with this longing to have closure. And some people can write a goodbye note and that's it. They make closure with it. Other people will take a pile of pictures of memories and things, put them in a fire, and that's it. Other people, they just can't seem to let go. So therefore, what do? They tend to go right back into the relationship until they can find some way of making closure with it. And what I hope is that you don't have some sort of emotional baggage that comes with these unresolved issues and going back into a relationship, and then it's stirring up a bunch of things that are really, really difficult to handle. It's all part of the messiness of life, but it's real. It happens, and it happens around you all the time. So give some thought to imagining these scenarios, and what would you do if you encountered something like that? Would you re-engage? A lot of people will. A lot of people will. And again, remember the circumstance here. It didn't end where people were really upset. It just sort of melted away. And people like to pick up where they left off and create an alternate ending to the story, if you will. Happens all the time in life. Sex is a pretty powerful ending to any story. I'm John Johnson, and this is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.